One small act of kindness, one stranger in the rain, and a truth that would change everything. What happened next? You won't believe how one simple act of kindness changed two lives forever. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The door creaked open just as the morning rush reached its peak. Rain followed him in. Soft, relentless, soaking the edges of a coat that had once been expensive, now threadbare and tired. He moved slowly, not with the caution of age, but the hesitation of someone who had grown used to being invisible. The cafe was warm, too warm. The windows fogged with breath and stories. Couples whispered over half-finished croissants. Businessmen stabbed at laptops between gulps of espresso. No one looked up, except her, but not yet. He walked toward the counter. His shoes made no sound, but the water they left behind did. The barista barely noticed him at first. Young, sharp, eyes already bored. "One black coffee," the man said. His voice was gravel wrapped in silk, soft, but heavy. "That's $2.75, came the reply. The man reached into his coat, then deeper. Then panic began to bloom on his face. Pocket after pocket. Nothing. I must have left my wallet," he murmured, cheeks flushing. The barista's tone shifted. Louder now. "This isn't a shelter, sir." Eyes turned. Tables paused. A woman in heels laughed behind her hand. A man in a suit muttered, "Figures." "I wasn't asking for charity," the old man said quietly. "Just a place to sit until the rain." "You can sit outside," the barista snapped. And so he turned. Slowly. Shoulders drawn up against more than the cold. And that's when Emma stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't glare. She just placed her tray down, reached into her pocket, pulled out a single wrinkled $5 bill, and set it on the counter. "I've got it," she said. The barista scoffed. "Emma, seriously?" She didn't answer him. She was watching the old man. He looked at her like people do when they've forgotten what kindness feels like. Like maybe it wasn't real. She nodded toward the booth by the window. "Please. Sit. I'll bring it over." The man hesitated, then obeyed. As if the invitation cost more than the coffee ever could. The cafe resumed its hum. But something had shifted. Whispers replaced laughter. Eyes dropped. Emma moved behind the counter and poured the drink herself. Steam curled like a secret between her fingers. She walked it over, placed it in front of him without ceremony. "You don't owe me anything," she said. He met her gaze, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, not obligation. Recognition. Later, her coworkers rolled their eyes. "Maybe he'll leave you a tip in IOUs," one sneered. Emma smiled without warmth. She'd heard worse. What they didn't know, what they never asked, was why she did it. They didn't know about her mother collapsing in a grocery store when Emma was 14. How people stepped around them like litter. How one woman knelt, gave them water, and didn't ask for anything in return. Emma never knew her name, but she never forgot. So when she saw the old man today, drenched, humiliated, turning away, there was no question. Only motion. Only memory. Only $5 and a little dignity passed hand to hand. What Emma didn't know What none of them knew was that the man who now sipped quietly by the window wasn't poor, wasn't desperate, wasn't lost. He was watching, measuring, waiting for someone real, someone who didn't smile for cameras, who didn't treat compassion like a resume bullet point. Charles H. Everlyn had built empires, lost love, outlived friends, buried trust. Now, with no heirs and too many zeros, he was looking for something more difficult than profit. A reason to believe. And this waitress, with tired eyes and a trembling $5 bill, just gave it to him. But Emma? Emma just wiped a table, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and returned to work. She didn't know her life had just changed, that $5 would echo further than she ever imagined. That being seen, really seen, could rewrite everything. Because sometimes, the richest moments come from the poorest places. Emma Bennett had always been the kind of person who showed up for her little sister, for her coworkers, for people who wouldn't remember her name after she refilled their coffee. She was 29, and every morning started the same way. Boots on at 5 o'clock a.m., a thermos of lukewarm tea, and a silent prayer that the walk to the cafe wouldn't soak through her socks again. The cafe was called The Junction, but it felt more like a junction of lives that barely noticed hers. She didn't resent it, not exactly, but she carried a quiet fatigue, the kind that settles in the bones of people who've been surviving too long. Her life was split between a double shift and a double role, waitress by day, caregiver by night. Lily, her younger sister, had been sick for 2 years now. Not hospital sick, just tired, fragile, often cold. Emma called it the slow kind, the kind that made you rearrange your life in small, permanent ways. Their apartment was 3 flights up, one window stuck halfway open, and every wall thin enough to hear each other breathe. Emma's wardrobe was built from secondhand stores, her meals from coupons and leftovers. But somehow, she always made Lily's plate a little fuller. She never complained, never expected rescue, just held on. There was an old photo on her fridge, her mom, beaming, with arms around both daughters. Emma couldn't remember the last time she smiled like that, but she looked at it every night, like a lighthouse, a warning, a reason. At the cafe, she was known for being nice. "Emma's got the patience of a monk," someone once joked, or a martyr. But none of them knew how many times she'd stood in the bathroom between shifts, breathing through anxiety like contractions, or how often she counted her tips with shaking hands, deciding between laundry and medicine. And yet, she never let bitterness bloom. Because once, just once, someone had chosen to be kind to her when she had nothing, and that moment had rooted itself deep. So when she saw the old man that morning, drenched, ignored, humiliated, something in her reached forward before her mind even caught up. It wasn't a decision. It was muscle memory. It was Emma being exactly who she'd promised herself she'd be. When no one was watching. When no one thought it mattered. And especially when it did. 3 mornings after the rain, something strange arrived. An envelope. Heavy. Cream-colored. No return address. No stamp. Just her name written in handwriting too careful to be casual. Emma Bennett. She opened it slowly, fingers smudged with coffee grounds and soap. Inside was a single ivory card. I never thanked you. Let me. No name. No explanation. Only a second item. A card. Thick, matte black, embossed in silver. Everlyn Holdings. Emma blinked. She knew the name. Everyone in the city did. Skyscraper money. Boardroom power. A man whose face had graced the covers of finance magazines but never tabloids. Charles H. Everlyn. Her stomach tightened. It had to be a mistake. She reread the note 4 times, showed it to no one. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the card like it might bite. Maybe it's a prank, Lily suggested. Emma nodded. Probably. But she didn't throw it away. She placed it under her pillow. The next morning, she passed the Everlyn building on her way to work. She'd passed it every day for 6 years, never once looked up. That day, she did. The glass tower shimmered in the sunlight. Clean, imposing, silent, like a place built to never remember girls like her. But the card was still in her pocket. At lunch, she walked there, just to see. Her shoes clicked too loudly on the marble floor of the lobby. A security guard looked up, then down at the card she nervously held out. Emma Bennett, she whispered. He didn't question it. Top floor, he said. He's expecting you. The elevator was too quiet. Her reflection in the chrome walls looked too small. She stepped out into silence. No assistant, no noise. Just a room that smelled like leather and oak, and him, the same man from the cafe. No coat, no awkward posture, no shame in his eyes. Just presence. Thank you for coming, he said. I almost didn't, she replied honestly. He gestured to the seat across from him. She sat. I didn't forget my wallet that day, he said. I left it at home. Emma said nothing. I needed to see who still acted with heart, when there was nothing to gain. No spotlight, no transaction, just instinct. She frowned. So you were testing people? He shook his head. I wasn't testing. I was hoping. A silence settled. Why me? She asked. Because you acted like someone I used to know, he said softly. Before I forgot what kindness looks like. She didn't know how to respond to that. But then he smiled. I'm not offering you a job or a reward. I'm asking for coffee. Again. But this time, as myself. Emma looked down at her hands. Rough palms, bitten nails, a waitress with too many responsibilities and too little space to breathe. And across from her, a man who could buy the block but came asking for time. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just said, all right, 1 cup, but I choose the cafe. He smiled wider, and I'll pay this time. Neither of them knew. That moment would be the beginning, not of a love story, but of something deeper, something rare. 2 people learning how to be human again. Their first real coffee happened in a cafe Emma picked, a quiet spot 3 blocks from her apartment. Nothing fancy. Vinyl chairs, chipped mugs, a menu written in marker on a whiteboard that hadn't been wiped clean in months. She liked it because no one expected anything there. Charles arrived on time. No driver, no bodyguards. Just a navy sweater and a smile that looked unsure. Human. Emma was nervous. She hid it well, behind a well-wiped table, a perfectly folded napkin, and a voice that didn't shake even when her fingers did. They didn't talk about money. They talked about music, about how silence sometimes says more than words, about how her sister Lily liked classical but hated opera. They talked like people who had nothing to prove, and when they finished their drinks, he asked if she'd meet him again. Just once more. She said yes, but that's when the lines started to blur. The second meeting wasn't coffee. It was a walk through a community garden he helped fund. The third was a visit to a local shelter where he donated anonymously. "Why bring me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because I want you to see the parts of me no one else does." It should have felt sweet, but it didn't. It felt confusing. Because Charles didn't act like the wealthy men on the news, or the rich customers who tipped with condescension. He listened. He remembered. When she mentioned Lily's illness in passing, a week later he asked if the medication was hard to find. That made something twist in her chest. Because no one asked things like that unless they planned to offer help. And Emma wasn't sure she could handle that. Not from him. Especially not from him. At work, the whispers started. Josh, her coworker, laughed. "He gonna buy you a condo now, Em?" Marcy rolled her eyes. "Guess kindness pays, huh?" She didn't answer them, but she heard them. And worse, she started hearing herself. What was this? An act of gratitude? A man testing people? A strange attempt at companionship from someone who lived so far above her world it barely touched hers. Emma began pulling back, showing up late, answering texts slower, choosing cafes further and further from home. Until one afternoon, Charles noticed. "You're distant," he said gently. She looked at her coffee. "You're not who I expected." "I can say the same." "I don't know what this is," she admitted. "It doesn't have to be anything yet," he replied. She wanted to believe him, but people didn't offer attention without a price. And Emma had spent years paying invisible debts, of guilt, of survival, of never asking too much. She wasn't sure she knew how to receive. But then one day, Lily asked quietly, "Do you like him?" Emma didn't answer. She just said, "He's kind." And Lily smiled. "Then maybe you can be too." That night, Emma didn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the street lamps flicker, wondering if kindness was always this heavy because something in her was changing. But change never comes quietly. Emma began to save the napkins, not on purpose. At first it was just a reflex. He would write something on one during their meetings. A quote from a book. A strange fact about rivers. A line from a poem she'd never heard but somehow felt like she'd lived. She folded them, slipped them into her journal. And one day she realized she had 12. 12 moments. 12 tiny pieces of thoughtfulness. 12 reasons her walls were starting to crack. She didn't tell anyone, especially not Lily. Because how could she explain what it felt like to be seen without being pursued? To be remembered without being possessed? It didn't fit any category she knew. One night, Charles brought her a loaf of bread, said it reminded him of a bakery in Prague. Another time, he gave her a worn copy of The Little Prince, annotated in the margins with thoughts so soft they made her want to cry. And once he brought nothing, just sat with her in the park, in silence, as the sun dipped behind the buildings. That was the one she remembered most. No gifts, no lines, just presence. Still, the fear returned, like a tide. Some days she'd wake up and feel her chest tighten with the thought, what if I start expecting this? Because Emma had trained herself to survive on crumbs, and Charles, he was offering something more dangerous: consistency. She began to push back, gently. Canceled one meeting, left his message on read, pulled her coat tighter when he smiled too warmly. And yet, every time he showed up again, with the same quiet smile, the same steady kindness, something in her thawed. One day, Lily found the napkins. "What are these, Jo?" she asked. Emma blushed. "Nothing." Lily picked one up and read aloud. "The heart has reasons that reason does not understand." She looked at Emma. "You're in trouble." Emma laughed. A real one. The first in days. That evening she made 2 cups of tea, placed one by the window, left the other untouched. It was a ritual now, like sending out a lighthouse signal, not asking to be found, just hoping someone still saw her light. She thought of her mother, how she used to hum while folding laundry, even when they had nothing. "Kindness doesn't keep score," she used to say. And Emma believed it. Still did. But belief doesn't always silence fear. So when Charles showed up with no agenda, no ask, and simply said, "Want to walk?" she didn't say yes, but she grabbed her coat. And that was enough. Because even though she hadn't said it yet, Emma was starting to want more than survival. She was beginning to want softness, and maybe she was ready to believe she deserved it. It unraveled slowly, like most things that matter. It began with a photo, blurry, cropped, taken from across the street. Just Emma and Charles sitting at a bench near the fountain downtown, coffee in hand. Nothing romantic, nothing scandalous. But the caption was brutal. "From waitress to heiress, someone's playing the long game." It spread fast. A local gossip blog picked it up. Then a citywide Instagram account reposted it with fire emojis and a poll. "How long till he proposes?" Emma found out when Marcy waved her phone in the kitchen. "Guess you've got fans now," she sneered. Josh chuckled. "If I knew billionaires were this easy to catch, I'd wear tighter aprons." Emma walked away without answering, but her ears burned. By noon, her manager called her in. "This cafe isn't a stage," he said flatly. "I didn't make it one." "Well, someone did. We're getting calls, Emma. People asking if you're dating a customer, asking if we've got some sugar daddy special going on." Her throat tightened. It's not like that." He sighed. "Whatever it is, it's a distraction. Handle it." The next day, she skipped her lunch with Charles. Then the next. When he texted, she wrote back, "Sorry, things are messy right now. I need space." He didn't reply. And somehow, that hurt more. That weekend, Lily found her sitting on the floor in front of the fridge, surrounded by mail and unopened bills. "You okay?" Emma shook her head. "I don't know who I am when people are watching." Lily sat beside her. "Then stop looking at them." "But they're looking at me." "And?" Emma whispered. "What if I start believing what they say?" Lily didn't answer. She just leaned against her shoulder. That night, Emma found a small package at her door. No name, just a ribbon tied in a knot only old hands would make. Inside, a book, worn, dog-eared. The Little Prince. Again. Only this copy had different handwriting in the margins. Her handwriting. It was hers, her mother's old copy, the one she'd sold years ago at a used bookstore when money was too tight to breathe. And now, somehow, it had found its way back. Tucked inside was a note. I found this. Thought it belonged to someone who still remembers how to see with the heart. She didn't cry. Not right away. She made tea, held the book to her chest, and let the silence answer all the things she didn't know how to ask. The next morning, she walked back to the garden where they'd met last. Charles was there, reading. She sat down beside him without speaking. He didn't look surprised. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head. "I hate being seen," she said. He turned the page. "Then why are you here?" Emma looked at her hands. "Because when you look, it doesn't feel like judgment." He closed the book. "That's because I'm not looking at your mistakes," he said. "I'm looking at your meaning." She let the words settle, then whispered, "Don't go quiet on me." "I wasn't," he said. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to remember you were never pretending." And somehow, those were the exact words she didn't know she needed. Sometimes, healing doesn't begin with medicine. Sometimes, it begins with being heard. 3 weeks passed without a headline, without a meeting, without a word. Emma returned to her shifts, returned to Lily, returned to her quiet routines. But something in her had changed. She no longer braced for judgment in every room. She no longer flinched when customers raised their voices. Something had settled in her, not comfort, but clarity. Then, on a Tuesday, she almost called forgettable. The second envelope arrived. No gold leaf, no name, just a stamped train ticket. Round trip. Destination, Montreal. Departure. Saturday, 6:45 a.m. Attached was a card, this time handwritten. "If you need to disappear without running away, I'll be there." No signature. She stared at it for hours. Not with fear, with decision. Lily watched her pack. 2 shirts, 1 book. The basil sprig she'd grown in a chipped mug, now placed gently in a cloth pouch. "You're scared," Lily said. "I am." "Do it anyway." The train was nearly empty. Emma sat by the window, watched the city fade into woods, the woods into mountains, the mountains into stillness. Charles was waiting at the station, not in a car, just standing there holding 2 cups of tea in paper cups. "You came," he said, soft. "You invited," she replied. They didn't speak for the first hour. Walked through the cobblestone streets, toured a bookstore, watched a violinist play near a statue. That night, in a cabin just outside the city, she found herself curled on a couch beside a fire. He brought out a journal. "I used to keep one," he said. "Stopped when I thought I had nothing left to say." Emma opened the first page. There, in clean handwriting, was one sentence. "Kindness is a currency that spends itself." He looked at her. "I've been investing in the wrong things." She said nothing. He continued. "Buildings, stocks, projects. But what lasts? are names you whisper to yourself at night. People who saw you. People who stayed. Emma touched the fire-warmed mug in her hands. I don't know if I can stay. I'm not asking you to. She turned to him. Then what are you asking? He met her eyes. Walk beside me. Not forever. Just until the next page. It wasn't a declaration. It was an invitation. And somehow, that felt safer. That weekend, they volunteered at a local youth center. Emma helped sort art supplies. Charles fixed a broken chair. A girl with wide eyes asked Emma, "Is that your dad?" She smiled. "No, just a man I have coffee with sometimes." The girl nodded. "He looks like someone important." Emma paused. "He is." But what she didn't say was, he made her feel important too. On the train ride back, Charles handed her a folded letter. "Open it later," he said. She did. That night, inside were words she never expected. Whatever this is, it's not about legacy or loneliness. It's about how peace began to feel possible again. With you. She folded the letter slowly, held it to her chest, and whispered to the dark, "Maybe I don't have to keep choosing between being strong and being seen." Because for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to walk alone. The foundation paperwork came on a Wednesday. No velvet folder, no ceremony. Just an envelope handed to Emma at the cafe as she clocked out. Inside, legal documents bearing her name. The Emma Bennett Opportunity Fund. She read the cover page 5 times before turning it over. It didn't say gift. It said beginning. Charles had left a note in his crisp handwriting. "You don't owe me anything. But if you ever wanted to give others what you gave me, a reason to believe, this might help." She sat in the break room holding that envelope for a long time. Then she placed it carefully in her bag and didn't speak of it to anyone. Not yet. 2 nights later, Charles invited her to a rooftop of an old converted church they were renovating into a shelter. They stood facing the skyline. The city lights shimmered like a sea of untold stories. "I've built too many things," he said quietly, "but none of them held people like you in mind." Emma turned to him. "You want to leave your name on something?" He shook his head. "I want to leave it off. This isn't mine anymore." Silence passed. Wind curled between them. Emma touched the envelope in her coat pocket, then looked up. "I want to do something with it," she said. "But not this way. Not as a symbol. I want to build it from scratch, on my own name, my own terms." "You already are," he replied. She didn't cry, but she blinked slowly, then took his hand, not with romance, not with hesitation, but with the kind of gratitude that comes from being seen and not touched, helped and not handled. He looked at her. "Whatever you build, I'll stand behind it, but you lead." She smiled. "I was never looking for someone to lead me. I was looking for someone who wouldn't disappear when I finally did." Charles nodded. No disappearing, just walking beside. They sat down on a weather-worn bench. Below them, traffic pulsed like a heartbeat. "You changed something in me," he said. Emma shook her head. "No, you were already ready to change. I just showed up." They watched the lights, talked of nothing and everything. He told her about his wife, how she once made soup for a neighbor every Thursday, even when she was sick. Emma shared about Lily, how she once sold her guitar to buy groceries without telling her. It wasn't tragedy. It was truth. That night, as they walked back to the station, Charles paused outside a quiet lot. "I've been thinking," he said. "What if we reopened your cafe?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "The same one?" "No, not the building. The feeling." She smiled slowly. "A place where no one has to earn kindness." He nodded. "I'll fund it quietly. You run it loudly." And for the first time since the rain-soaked day they met, Emma didn't feel out of place. She felt like a place was finally being built around her, not to save her, to reflect her. They didn't kiss. They didn't promise. But they didn't need to. Some stories don't need endings to feel whole. They just need witnesses. The sign on the window was simple, painted by hand, letters slightly uneven, gold on soft green. First Cup Cafe, and underneath, in script that looked like a whisper, no one should have to earn kindness. Emma stood by the counter, wiping down the same corner for the third time, not because it was dirty, but because some habits stayed even after healing arrived. The cafe was hers now, but more importantly, it belonged to everyone. A teacher with tired eyes came in at 7:04 a.m., sat without ordering. Emma brought her tea anyway. A young man with paint on his hands dropped $1 on the counter. Emma waved it away. "Save it for your second cup," she smiled. Behind her, the chalkboard wall bore scribbled messages from strangers. "You saved me and didn't even know it. Came for coffee. Stayed for peace. First time I felt safe in weeks. No prices. Just a jar labeled, 'Pay it forward if you can.'" The air smelled like cinnamon and courage. Lily ran the corner bookshelf now. She walked without the limp these days. Charles stopped by every Friday. Never early, never late. He brought bread, quiet presence, no speeches. Once someone asked if he was the owner. Emma had simply said, "No. He's the reason we believed it was possible." That evening, as rain tapped the windows in soft, steady rhythms, Emma watched a man hesitate outside. Tattered coat, eyes wary. He didn't move toward the door, so she opened it for him. "You're welcome to come in," she said. He looked at her like she might vanish, then stepped inside. Emma handed him a mug. "No questions. First cup's on us." He nodded. The warmth in his hands made his shoulders drop. And Emma, she didn't say much more, because she didn't need to. Later that night, when the cafe emptied and the lights dimmed, she found a folded note tucked under the napkin holder. One line. "Still walking beside you. See." She smiled, left the note on the windowsill, locked the front door, and walked home in the rain. No umbrella, no hurry. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the storm. She was walking through it, with peace in her pocket.